Evelyn had always been the cornerstone of her family. She was a mother, a wife, and a caretaker, roles she had cherished deeply throughout her life. Now, in the quiet of her later years, she found herself alone in a house that once buzzed with laughter and the hustle of everyday life. The walls, which had once echoed with the voices of children growing up, now felt hollow and silent. The photos of her family hung on the walls, frozen in time, reminders of the bustling household she had nurtured. Her husband George had passed away 5 years ago, leaving Evelyn to navigate life on her own. The grief of losing him still clung to her like a heavy cloak, but she had managed as she always had. She had raised 2 children, Jennifer and Mark, with love, sacrifice, and determination. The days were long and exhausting, but the rewards were worth it. Her children had grown up, found careers, and had families of their own. Evelyn, always proud, watched as they built their lives. Yet, now that the tables had turned, she felt abandoned. She was no longer the energetic woman who once ran the house like a well-oiled machine. Her body had betrayed her over the years. Her knees ached with every step, and her back, once strong from lifting and carrying, now creaked under the weight of age. But Evelyn wasn't one to show weakness. She kept a brave face, tending to her garden, cleaning the house, and cooking her meals, all while telling herself that this was just a phase. She would heal, she would get stronger. That rainy afternoon, however, was different. The storm had rolled in quickly, and Evelyn had gone out to bring in the laundry. Her old bones weren't as quick as they once were, and as she stepped onto the porch, her foot caught the edge of the step. She tumbled forward, her leg twisting awkwardly beneath her. The pain was sharp and immediate, an intense throbbing that made her gasp for air. She lay on the cold concrete, trying to steady her breath, but the pain overwhelmed her. She tried to stand, but her leg wouldn't move. A sharp cry escaped her lips, and panic began to set in. Evelyn knew something was wrong. She had to get help. With trembling hands, she reached for the phone by her side. Her heart sank as she dialed Mark's number first. He would be the one to help her, she thought. They had always been close, even after he moved away to start his own family. She waited for the familiar voice to answer, but there was only silence. She dialed again, but the call went unanswered. Frustration bubbled inside her, quickly replaced by a cold, sinking feeling. She hadn't heard from Mark in weeks, and now in her moment of need, he was unreachable. Desperate, she called Jennifer. Maybe she could help, maybe she was just busy, surely she would care. But once again, the phone rang endlessly with no answer. Evelyn's heart began to race, her breath quickened as she tried to stand once more. But her leg wouldn't support her weight. She couldn't stay on the ground forever. With a growing sense of dread, Evelyn made one more attempt. She texted Jennifer, hoping for a quick reply. But the minutes ticked by and still nothing. Her thumb hovered over the screen as she typed one last message. I've fallen. I need help. Please. Minutes turned into hours and Evelyn lay there, the darkness beginning to settle in. The only sound was the soft patter of rain against the roof. She kept hoping, waiting for one of her children to call back, to come and help her. But as the rain intensified, her hope began to fade. Eventually, Jennifer replied with a terse text. Mom, we're really busy right now. Can't you call someone else for help? Evelyn's heart dropped. The word stung more than the fall itself. Can't you call someone else? She had given so much of her life for them. Sacrificed her health, her career, her dreams. All to ensure they were happy, successful, and safe. And now, when she was the one in need, they couldn't even spare a moment of their time. With tears threatening to spill, Evelyn mustered the strength to call Mark once again. This time, the call went straight to voicemail. She left a brief message. Mark, I've fallen. I need help, please call me back. She hung up, the silence that followed almost suffocating her. It wasn't just the physical pain of the fall. It was the crushing realization that her children, her own flesh and blood, had chosen to turn their backs on her. For the first time, Evelyn felt the full weight of loneliness that had quietly crept into her life since George's passing. She had given everything for her family, and yet now in her hour of need, they had chosen to shut her out. As the night settled in, Evelyn closed her eyes and let the tears flow, not just for her broken leg, but for the broken bond with the children she had raised with such love. The storm outside raged on, but inside the silence was deafening. The days that followed Evelyn's fall were filled with quiet suffering. The pain in her leg never fully subsided. Each movement sent a wave of agony through her body. The swelling was severe, and her once reliable leg was now an immobile burden. The thought of waiting for someone to help seemed too far-fetched. There was no one left to turn to. Her children, the ones she had nurtured with every ounce of her being, had closed the door on her. Each day, Evelyn tried to carry on as best as she could. She would pull herself to the kitchen, using the counter for support, making herself small meals, even though she could barely stand. The house felt like a prison. The silence of the rooms around her was deafening, the empty chairs at the dinner table a constant reminder of the life she had once had. Her phone, once filled with the buzz of messages and calls from family, now lay untouched on the table. She would glance at it every few minutes, hoping for a message and answer, but the screen remained silent. No one had reached out. No one cared. It was hard for her to admit, but the reality was undeniable. Her children, the ones she had sacrificed so much for, had chosen their own lives over her needs. They had stopped calling, stopped checking in. The woman who had been their protector, their source of strength, had now been abandoned. And in those long, lonely hours, Evelyn felt a deep sorrow gnawing at her heart. She had always prided herself on being independent. She had raised Mark and Jennifer on her own, working 2 jobs, making sure they never went hungry or without what they needed. But now in her old age, she found herself unable to do even the simplest things, like getting out of bed without feeling like her entire body might break in half. The thought of calling for help from someone outside of her family seemed too much to bear. Who would help an old woman like her when her own children wouldn't? Still, there were moments when hope sparked faintly. When the pain would subside for just a second, she would call Jennifer again or Mark, praying that this time they would pick up. But the call would go to voicemail or worse, be ignored completely. She left messages, telling them she needed them. She reminded them of the love she had given them, all the sacrifices. But nothing. Her heart sank with each unanswered call. One afternoon, her neighbor Robert, who had always been kind though he too was aging, knocked on her door. He had heard about her fall from a mutual friend and had come to check on her. His voice was soft, concerned. "Evelyn, you've been in my thoughts. I thought maybe you could use some help. Can I drive you to the doctor? Or bring you some groceries?" His words were gentle, but Evelyn could see the limitations in his eyes. Robert had his own health issues, and though he was kind enough to offer, Evelyn knew he couldn't be her constant source of support. He was her neighbor, not her family. And as much as she appreciated his kindness, she couldn't help but feel the sting of not having her children there when she needed them most. "Thank you, Robert," she said, her voice cracking. "But I think I'll be fine. I don't want to trouble you. I'll manage somehow." She tried to smile, but it felt hollow. Robert didn't push her. Instead, he sat with her for a while, talking about old times, about the neighborhood, about the weather. His presence was comforting, but the loneliness lingered in the background, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. When he left, Evelyn was alone again. She sat in her chair, staring at the phone, the silence overwhelming her. She wondered how long it would take for her children to even realize that she was in pain, that she was struggling. She wondered if they would ever care again. That evening, as the sun began to set, Evelyn made another call to Jennifer. She dialed the number, her heart sinking before the phone even began to ring. When it went to voicemail again, she left a message. But this time the words felt different. More final. "Jennifer, I don't know what to say anymore. I've called, I've left messages. I'm just not sure I can keep doing this. Please. I need help. I'm not asking for much, just a little care. I don't know what happened to us, but I need you to remember what I've done for you. What I've given up for you. I need you now." She hung up, her hands trembling as she wiped the tears from her eyes. The weight of it all, the loneliness, the abandonment, the physical pain, felt too heavy to bear. It was as if her world had narrowed to this small, suffocating apartment, with no one to turn to but herself. The hours passed slowly, each one feeling like an eternity. Evelyn lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had gone wrong. Where had things turned? When did her children stop seeing her as the woman who had always been there, the one who had always held everything together? She had given them everything, her time, her energy, her love, and now it seemed that they couldn't even be bothered to return her calls. The next day, she woke with a sense of resignation. She had no choice but to face the reality that her children weren't coming. There was no more waiting for a call that would never come. No more hoping that they would remember her, care for her, help her. They had made their choice, and that choice didn't include her. The days dragged on and Evelyn's frustration grew. Each new morning felt like a repeat of the last: pain, silence, and rejection. The phone remained silent, and the calls to her children continued to go unanswered. Every unanswered call, every ignored message, only deepened the wound she carried in her chest. The woman who had once given everything for her children now felt like a stranger in her own home, abandoned by the very people she had raised. But as the days stretched into weeks, something inside Evelyn shifted. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface began to boil over. She wasn't angry just at her children. She was angry at herself for ever believing that they would take care of her. She had spent her life prioritizing their needs, sacrificing her own health and happiness to see them thrive. She had loved them unconditionally, but now she was being forced to confront a painful truth. Her love had been one-sided. They didn't need her anymore. They had moved on with their lives, and she was nothing but a burden to them. Evelyn's anger wasn't a simple, fleeting emotion. It was a fire that burned deep within her. How dare they ignore her like this? How dare they turn their backs on the woman who had spent years making sure they had everything they needed? The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. But there was no one to yell at, no one to confront. Her children had already made it clear they didn't want to be a part of her life. So instead of sitting in her helplessness, Evelyn decided to do something she had never done before. She would stop waiting for them. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn made a decision. She would stop waiting for her children's approval or their help. If they weren't going to care, then she would take control of her own life. She was still alive, still breathing, and she wasn't going to let this broken leg define her. She had been through harder things in her life and had always found a way to push through. She had never let anything stop her before, and she wasn't going to let this stop her now. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew that. Her body was weak, her leg was still swollen, and the pain was constant. But Evelyn had always been strong in her own quiet way. She didn't need anyone to tell her she could do it. She had been a mother, a wife, a worker, and a caregiver for so many years. Now it was her turn to take care of herself. The following morning, Evelyn woke with a new sense of determination. She would call a doctor. She would make appointments. She would figure out a way to get her leg treated, even if she had to do it all on her own. She didn't have time for self-pity, and she wasn't going to waste any more energy being angry. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Her children had shown her their true colors, and now she would show them hers. She would show them that she didn't need them. Evelyn struggled out of bed, bracing herself against the pain. She hobbled to the kitchen, grabbed her phone, and dialed the doctor's office. She was polite, calm, and direct. She explained her injury and asked to be seen as soon as possible. She didn't care that it would take multiple visits, that it would take effort, that it would be hard. She had no other choice. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt a spark of hope. She was taking control of her own future. She wasn't going to sit around waiting for people who didn't care. The next few days were a blur of doctor visits, pain medications, and physical therapy. The pain in her leg was constant, but it no longer felt like a barrier. Every time she pushed through another painful exercise, every time she made it through another long, lonely day, she felt a little stronger, a little more determined. She wasn't going to let her age or her pain dictate her life. She wasn't going to let her children's indifference steal her dignity. In between the visits to the doctor and physical therapy, Evelyn found herself thinking less and less about her children. It was as if she had finally let go of the desperate hope that they would change, that they would remember who she was to them. The anger, though still there, began to fade, replaced by something more powerful: resolve. She would never again give her love freely to people who didn't value it. She was no longer going to wait for a phone call, an apology, or a visit from them. She had spent her entire life waiting for others to acknowledge her sacrifices, but now she understood something she hadn't before. Her worth wasn't dependent on their approval. The more Evelyn pushed forward, the more she felt like herself again. She may have been an old woman with a broken leg, but she was still Evelyn. She was still strong, still capable, and still worthy of respect. She didn't need her children to validate her. She didn't need anyone but herself. And so, Evelyn continued her journey of healing, both physically and emotionally. The anger that had consumed her was now channeled into something more productive: self-respect. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had some control over it. Evelyn had given up on waiting for her children to come back into her life, but she had found something more important: herself. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living again on her own terms. The weeks passed slowly, each one an effort to rebuild Evelyn's body and spirit. The physical therapy was grueling, her legs still sore and swollen, but with each painful movement, she felt herself getting stronger. The pain wasn't as overwhelming now, though it never truly left. Every morning as she braced herself against the ache, Evelyn reminded herself that this was her fight now. There was no one to share this burden, no one to make it easier. She was alone, but for the first time in a long time it didn't feel like the worst thing in the world. Her life had shrunk into the small apartment she had moved into, a far cry from the bustling family home she once had. The place was quiet, peaceful even, but loneliness hung in the air like an uninvited guest. Evelyn couldn't escape the silence that echoed through the empty rooms, a reminder of what she had lost. There were no voices of children, no hurried footsteps of family coming and going. Just her thoughts, and the constant ticking of the clock on the wall. She thought back to her old house, the one she had spent years maintaining, cleaning, and filling with memories. Felt so distant now. Evelyn had hoped that moving would bring some relief, a sense of fresh beginnings, but instead, it only reminded her of how much she had left behind. Every corner of her old house had once been filled with the laughter of her children, the smell of dinner cooking, the buzz of daily life. Now it was just a house, empty, silent, and cold. One afternoon, after another difficult session of physical therapy, Evelyn sat down to rest. She glanced at her phone. It was the first time in weeks she had even considered calling her children again. She had tried to let go of the hope, but it lingered, stubborn and unshakable. She had thought maybe they would come around, maybe they would realize the hurt they had caused, maybe they would finally pick up the phone. She dialed Mark's number first. The phone rang 3 times before it went to voicemail. Her thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment, she considered leaving a message again. "Mark, I'm in so much pain, I really need your help. Please." But no, she didn't want to beg. Not anymore. She had begged enough. Instead, she ended the call. She sat there in silence, the phone resting on her lap. The words from her daughter's last message still burned in her mind. "We can't afford to deal with your medical bills right now. Maybe later." Later. It stung each time she replayed it in her mind. But what hurt more was the realization that she didn't want to keep living like this. The denial, the waiting, the hope that they might change. It wasn't worth it anymore. Her children had made their choice. And now Evelyn had to make hers. Later that day, Jennifer called. It wasn't an unexpected call, but Evelyn's heart sank when she saw the name on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew deep down that nothing would change. "Hi, Mom." Jennifer's voice was flat, distant. "How are you doing?" Evelyn's anger flared. How was she doing? She had spent days, weeks trying to get help, trying to make her children understand her pain. And this was the best they could offer? A dry, emotionless question, as though she were asking about the weather. "I'm managing," Evelyn replied, forcing calm into her voice. "But I'm getting tired, Jennifer. Tired of this. This waiting, tired of being ignored. Tired of hoping for something that's never going to come." There was a pause on the other end. Evelyn could hear Jennifer's breath, the hesitation. Then came the inevitable words. "I'm sorry, Mom. You know how busy we are. Mark's job has been demanding lately, and we just can't do it right now. You'll have to manage, okay?" Evelyn's grip tightened on the phone. She hadn't expected an apology, not truly. She had only wanted a small acknowledgement, a sign that they understood how much she had given them, how much she was hurting now. But all she got was a cold brush off, a reminder that she was an inconvenience, nothing more. "Okay," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "I understand." But she didn't. She didn't understand why they couldn't see her. She didn't understand why, after everything, they couldn't be there for her. Even once. She didn't understand how they could walk away from everything she had given them, leaving her with nothing but her memories. She hung up the phone, the anger building within her, each beat of her heart echoing with a raw frustration. The tears that followed were quiet, bitter, and full of regret. Not just for the life she had lived, but for the life that had been promised to her. The life where her children would care for her, just as she had cared for them. She stood up, a surge of emotion propelling her forward. She wasn't going to take this anymore. No more tears. No more pleading. She had raised them, loved them, sacrificed for them. And now it was time to let go. She was done waiting for them to realize their mistakes. It was time for her to step forward, for her own peace of mind, for her own dignity. Evelyn turned her back on the phone, on the messages, on the unspoken promises that had been broken. She was done with the bitterness, done with the hurt. It was time to heal herself, to stop relying on people who didn't care. She was stronger than this. She was stronger than them. That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for them any longer. She wasn't going to let her life be defined by their choices. She was going to find peace on her own terms, without their approval or support. She wasn't going to be the broken, abandoned woman her children had left behind. She was going to be Evelyn again. The decision had been made. Evelyn knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she was done. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of what had been. Her children had made their choices, and now it was time for her to make hers. The anger that had burned inside her for so long had cooled into something much sharper. A quiet resolve. It had been years since she had truly felt like herself, years since she had been more than just a mother, a wife, a caregiver. She had lived for others, always sacrificing her own dreams, her own needs, in the name of love and duty. But now, with her body weakened and her spirit bruised, Evelyn realized she had to start living for herself. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it was the only way forward. Evelyn didn't want to keep waiting for apologies that would never come, or for her children to come around after they had made it clear they weren't interested in her well-being. She had given them everything, and they had walked away from her without a second thought. But the one thing they couldn't take from her was her own life, her own ability to shape her future. She couldn't stay in the house she had once shared with her family, the house that had now become a tomb of painful memories. It was a place filled with ghosts, the laughter of children that had long since faded, the meals prepared with love now left cold and forgotten. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a reminder of what she had lost, and Evelyn couldn't bear it any longer. She started looking for a small apartment, somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about anything other than the simple need to be free of the suffocating memories. She didn't need much. Just a place to call her own where she could start fresh, start over. The search took time. Finding the right place, negotiating the rent, the moving process, but Evelyn approached it with determination. This was her first step in taking control of her own life again. The day she signed the lease for her new apartment was a quiet victory. It wasn't a grand celebration, but it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was reclaiming herself. She was leaving behind the life that had become a prison, the life she had spent so many years building for others. She wasn't doing this for anyone but herself. Moving was exhausting. There were boxes to pack, furniture to arrange, and all the small details that came with starting over. But Evelyn took it in stride. It was hard, yes, but it was also freeing. She wasn't just rearranging furniture. She was rearranging her life. Each item she moved into the new apartment felt like a small act of defiance against the years of neglect and emotional abandonment. It wasn't easy to leave the old house. Every corner, every room held a memory, a fleeting moment in time that she could never get back. But there was no room for nostalgia, not anymore. She had to move forward. And with every step she took, she felt a little lighter, a little freer. The first night she spent in her new apartment, Evelyn stood by the window, looking out over the city. It was quiet here, not as lonely as she had feared. In the stillness of the night, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. There were no phone calls she was waiting for, no unanswered messages, no expectations weighing her down. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn could breathe without the weight of rejection crushing her chest. But even with the peace, the loneliness remained. It wasn't something that could disappear overnight. There were days when the silence of the apartment was overwhelming, when the emptiness of the space reminded her of what she had lost. But there was something else now, a glimmer of something she hadn't had in years: hope. Evelyn started finding small ways to fill the space, things that made her feel alive again. She took up painting, something she had always enjoyed but had set aside years ago. She spent time in the garden, nurturing the small plants she had brought with her from the old house. She didn't need much to feel whole again. She just needed to reconnect with herself, to remember the things she loved, the things that had made her happy before everything had been about everyone else. She began to explore the city more, walking through the parks, sitting at cafes, and even joining a local book club. She wasn't seeking validation, nor was she looking for her children to come back into her life. But what she found was something unexpected. New connections, new friendships. People who saw her for who she was now. Not the mother, not the caretaker, but Evelyn, the woman who had lived through hardship and was still standing. It was a slow process, but each day felt like a small victory. And through it all, Evelyn realized that she didn't need her children's approval, or anyone else's, to feel fulfilled. She had spent so much of her life seeking their love and validation. But in the end, she learned that the most important love she could give was to herself. Her children had made their choice, and Evelyn had made hers. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose how she wanted to live moving forward. And the life she was building now, though different from what she had once imagined, was hers. It was real. It was hers to shape. And it was enough. As time passed, Evelyn's life slowly began to fall into a new rhythm. The pain in her leg, while never completely gone, became manageable. Her days were filled with small joys. The quiet satisfaction of finishing a painting, the sense of accomplishment from tending to her garden, the pleasure of reading a good book or sharing a conversation with a new friend at the local cafe. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt like she was living for herself. Yet, as peaceful as her new life was, a part of her still longed for the family she had lost. The loneliness never fully disappeared. There were evenings when the silence of the apartment felt suffocating, when she found herself reaching for the phone to call someone, anyone, but remembering that she had no one to call. Her children had not come around. The hope she had once held on to, that they might realize their mistakes, faded slowly. She had stopped waiting for them to reach out, but the emptiness still lingered. Every so often she would think of her old home, the house she had worked so hard to maintain, the house filled with the memories of her children growing up, of family gatherings, of love and laughter. Those memories were bittersweet now, tinged with regret and sorrow. Evelyn knew she could never go back to that life, but she couldn't help but wonder what could have been if things had been different. If her children had been there for her when she needed them most. If they had shown the same love and care she had given them without hesitation. But those what-ifs were no longer enough to hold her back. She had to let go of them. One evening, as Evelyn sat in her favorite chair, watching the last light of the day fade from the sky, a thought struck her with surprising clarity. She was at peace. It wasn't the peace of having everything fixed, or of having her family restored. It wasn't the kind of peace she had once imagined when she dreamed of a perfect, happy family. It was a peace born from acceptance, the acceptance that things could never be the way they once were, and that was okay. It was a peace that came from letting go of the past and embracing the future, however uncertain it might be. Evelyn's life had not turned out the way she had envisioned, but it had turned out to be hers. She had survived the abandonment of her children, the heartbreak of betrayal, and the isolation that came with growing old. But she had also discovered strength she never knew she had. She had learned to stand on her own, to find joy in simple things, to fill the emptiness with new experiences and new connections. She had built a life for herself, one that was quiet but meaningful. As the years went by, Evelyn's health began to decline. Her body, once strong and resilient, had started to show the wear and tear of age. The aches and pains that had once been only a reminder of her broken leg, now became a part of her everyday life. But Evelyn faced it with the same quiet dignity she had always carried. She was no longer afraid of being alone, and she no longer sought validation from her children or anyone else. She had found a peace within herself that no one could take away. One morning, as the sun rose over the city, Evelyn quietly passed away in her sleep. She had lived a long life, one full of love, sacrifice, and hardship. And in her final moments she was at peace, knowing that she had done everything she could for her family, even if they couldn't appreciate it. Her passing was not marked by grand gestures or public mourning. There were no calls from her children, no visits from family. Instead, a few neighbors and friends, those who had seen her through her final years, came to say their goodbyes. They remembered her for her strength, her kindness, and the quiet dignity with which she had faced every challenge. When her children finally heard of her passing, there were no tears, no regrets. There was no sense of loss. They had long since moved on with their lives, their own families, their own concerns. And Evelyn had accepted that. Her funeral was small, but it was enough. The few people who had cared for her in her final years paid their respects. The flowers, the words, the gestures, they were all small, simple things, but to Evelyn they were everything. They represented the love and care she had given to others, and that had come back to her in small but meaningful ways. Evelyn had spent much of her life waiting for her children to love her, to appreciate her, to show up when she needed them. But in the end, she learned that the love she needed most was the love she gave to herself. She had lived a full life, one filled with both pain and joy. She had loved, she had given, and she had learned to let go. Her story ended quietly, but it ended on her own terms. Evelyn had been a mother, a caregiver, a woman who had sacrificed everything for her family. And in the end she had found the greatest gift of all. The ability to love herself, to forgive, and to find peace even in the face of betrayal. In the end, Evelyn was not defined by the pain or the rejection. She was defined by her resilience, her strength, and her ability to find peace in a life that had not gone the way she had planned. And that was enough.